E7-4. E7-4. You're looking at it right now. It doesn't look difficult. So, yeah, I can. Your book, this chapter, and the debt service chapter does this too, as I recall, runs you through like some big. Oh, I didn't push that over all the way. Look at that.
Started on D.
Alrighty then. I'll just change things up a little. Runs you through an example, like a supposedly comprehensive example of what this looks like from the point of the beginning and opening and things like that to the closing entries, right? So it gives you examples of what all these entries look like, okay? Which actually cuts down a little bit on the pages of reading because they have just these entries that you get to look at, okay?
Do you actually have to put the other financing sources? Like,
right here?
Yeah.
This?
That, yes. Do you actually have to put that in your
Do you have to write it out?
No, if you put transfer from general fund, that's good enough.
Okay.
Because you should know, again, this is like the expenditures and the revenues, right? This is a category for your statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balance. Remember? Those statements, what they look like is you have revenues, you have expenditures, you have other sources, right? Or uses. Remember? And that's where you list your transfers and stuff.
Uses.
Then you have your change in fund balance. Okay, we'll see some of those because you have some of those too. Okay, so 7-4. Township Assembly agreed that a new police and fire. It says the following transactions and events occurred. Agreed that a new police and fire department building would be constructed at a cost not to exceed $1.5 million on land owned by the township. And then required, it says, prepared general journal entries to record the foregoing facts. Why would I not record an entry for number one?
It's just an agreement. There's nothing stating.
There's no budget.
This much.
Right. It's the budget. It's
official.
not the general ledger. Okay? Does that make sense? It's the budget. It's not the general ledger. We talked a little bit about that earlier after presentations. Differentiate between the budget and the general ledger. Right? What's actually happening. Okay? Number 2, cash with which to finance the project was received from the following sources. So you have cash. $100,000 comes from a transfer from the general fund. $500,000 comes from deferred revenues from the state federal grant. $900,000 comes from other financing sources. Okay? How do I know that the state and federal grant is deferred?
Well, one's a long-term note. Is that what you're...
A long-term note. No, the bank, this is a long-term note. How do I know this is a deferred revenue? Or why did I put that in deferred revenue? Huh? No. No.
Well, aren't grants like given over a period of time?
I haven't earned it.
Exactly.
Right? There's a couple things for revenues to become revenues, right? I have to have, it has to be available, I have to have collected it, and it has to be legally usable. It hasn't become legally usable yet.
Hence why it's deferred.
Yep, hence why it's deferred. Okay?
So what, I'm sorry, what
Yeah.
part of the language tells us that? It just, because it says...
Doesn't say that anywhere,
It just
really.
says it's for 1/3 of the project cost, not to exceed $500,000. So
Right.
is that what's telling us that...
It said, well, beyond that is actually what's telling you, any unearned balance. So if any unearned balance has to be returned, you know at this point that none of it's been earned. And your chapter talks about grants and how they're earned. Right? And different grants are earned in different ways, but in this case, this is telling you that it's been unearned. Okay? And anything that doesn't exceed, or not to exceed the $500,000 anything, then you have to return that, which we'll get to later. Okay? But because it was unearned, that's how you know it's a deferred revenue rather than a regular revenue. Right? Otherwise, if you knew you had earned it, you just record it as revenue. Okay? Number 3, cash was dispersed for building costs from the capital projects fund as follows. So my cash is dispersed here, right? I have construction contract, architect fees, engineering charges, cash of $1.470 million. Now, what can I do because I've spent that, right? I have earned it now. I've earned the grant, or at least a portion of the grant. I've earned $490,000 of the grant. I'm going to repay $10,000 of the grant.
Where is that coming from?
The 490.
Yeah.
So let's see if I left myself.
Any notes?
Why would I repay the $10,000? I gotta remember what I did.
Well, it says that a portion of the grant was refunded to the state, but it doesn't clarify how much.
Right.
And I thought it could only be a
I'm trying to
third
remember.
of the project.
That's why. That's why.
So is 490
Oh,
equal
that-
to
I
a
get
third
it,
of
I get it.
490 is
1470?
yeah. It's a
So you
third
had
of
30,000 left over, and you
That
had to
calculation.
repay 1/3 of that back to the state, or you had
Wait,
1/3.
say that again.
No, I've got it. It says the state federal grant is for 1/3 of the project cost.
It is 1/3 of the project cost. This
And
is
it
the
says
project
At
cost.
the end, you have 30,000 remaining. So would that mean if you didn't use all of that 1/3 of what you have left would go back to the state, which in this case would be 10,000?
Not 1/3. No, you're getting the 1/3 confused.
Okay.
So 1/3. So the state federal grant can be 1/3,
Or
right, of the
500,000.
project,
Yeah.
Right.
or
So you're
500,000,
doing a
right?
third of the 1.4.
1/3 of 1.47 million is
Yes,
490,000.
that's kind of where I was getting to.
Okay.
I
Okay.
just kind of went the long way around.
Yeah. Okay. That's as long however you got there, that's fine.
Well, yeah, all I was saying was that you had 30,000 remaining,
Uh huh.
and if you broke that down 3 ways.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So
So
it's like a longer way of.
Yeah.
Is the
yeah.
10
I
just
tend
the
to do that.
leftover from the 500,000 then?
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct. And this is to record that you're sending it back to the state,
Okay.
right? So this is due to the state.
Okay.
So you're taking it out of your deferred revenues and you're sending it back to the state. So here you're recognizing, you're taking it out of deferred revenues, you're recognizing the amount you can recognize,
Well, the third of the
right?
1.4.
A third of the project cost.
Okay.
And then the other 10,000 is left over, so you're returning that to the state.
Okay.
And then in number 4, you actually return it to the state, right? The 10,000 plus 20,000 you transfer to the general fund of the financing you didn't use, right? 20,000 of that 30,000.
Come
Okay.
again?
And then down here is your closing, right? Your closing entries. Okay.
So that 20,000 is the remainder from the bank and from the transfer to the grant.
Yeah, because it says the remaining cash was transferred to the general fund.
So eventually you're gonna have to pay back the 20,000, the other 10,000 to the bank, and then the other 10 will just stay in the general fund. Is that kind of what?
Yeah. Eventually, you would. Well, and what it's kind of saying is, eventually, you'll probably use this 20,000 to
pay
pay
back the
to
note.
service your debt.
To pay back the note.
That would be my assumption.
Okay.
It doesn't say that, but
Works for me.
that's what I would assume. So here's your closing entries because it says that you closed and terminated the fund, right? So they got done with the project. They did what they needed to do. They closed the fund. Okay. And they accounted for all the money. So back to the tracking idea, right? Using a capital projects fund so I can track what's happening. Okay. Questions on 7-4?